Hello, my name is Rachel McNally. I'm a PhD candidate at Carleton University, and where I'm working on my research about the resettlement of refugees with disabilities. I've also been working for Learn for about 6 years, and so I've been quite involved with the project over the years. So this book is called Forced Migration into Canada from Colonization to Refugee Resettlement. So it's an edited collection by Christina Clark-Kazak. There are many different contributors to the book, so I just wrote one chapter, the chapter about disability and resettlement policy. So the book is essentially trying to be an overview of forced migration, not only people coming to Canada, for example, resettlement and our refugee determination system, but also forced migration in Canada. So it begins with the forced migration of Indigenous peoples on these lands and other kinds of forced migration like slavery that also happened in Canada, and then moves on to other questions about resettlement, about sponsorship, about the refugee determination and asylum system, about other kinds of things, about some of the different intersectional experiences of refugees in Canada. So that's where my chapter about disability comes in, but there are also chapters about race and gender and other aspects of forced migration. The title, Forced Migration in and to Canada, is really intended to recognize the idea that people are coming to Canada, but also remembering that there is a history of forced displacement on these lands. And from colonization to refugee resettlement, again, is this kind of recognition that forced migration really does have this long history that begins with colonization and continues through to refugee resettlement. So there's a complex history of forced migration within and to Canada. And so the book tries to be relatively comprehensive in covering all these different time periods, I guess, but also aspects of forced migration in the Canadian context. So I wrote the chapter on disability, essentially. My chapter is called Disability and Medical Conditions in Canadian Refugee Resettlement. And so my chapter looks at Canada's refugee resettlement policies and how those impact refugees with disabilities or medical conditions. And then it also looks a little bit at the experiences of refugees with disabilities after they arrive in Canada and some of the kind of supports and opportunities, but also gaps in supports and challenges that they face. So it's a kind of an overview chapter of that topic. Now, there's not a lot of research on disability and refugees in Canada, or really in many places elsewhere around the world either. It's a kind of under-researched topic, which is why I'm excited about continuing this kind of research through my doctoral dissertation. But essentially, the chapter looks at kind of how Canada selects refugees, and in the case of the government-assisted refugees program in particular, that's through referrals from UNHCR. There is a category about medical needs, and so that does accept some refugees with certain medical conditions, especially those that are life-threatening and could benefit from treatment in Canada. But Canada has also tried to limit the resettlement of refugees with medical conditions through various numbers and guidance to UNHCR about their referrals. And then on the Canadian side, like once people arrive in Canada, there are opportunities for refugees with disabilities. So for example, some refugees with disabilities, some refugee children with disabilities are not able to go to school in the context where they are, so in their countries of asylum, because the school is either not equipped to support refugees with disabilities, or the school just refuses, or for whatever reason. Sometimes children with disabilities who are refugees are not able to access education. So sometimes they can come to Canada and access inclusive education for the first time. There are also other kinds of things, for example, technologies like motorized wheelchairs or other kinds of technologies that refugees may be able to access in Canada that are not available in country of asylum contexts. So that can be a real benefit of resettlement to Canada. However, there are also significant challenges. There's ongoing stigma and discrimination, both against refugees, but also against people with disabilities in general in Canada. And so that can be a challenge. Some of the other challenges are things like a lack of accessible housing, which is a challenge for many people across Canada, not just refugees. And then there are challenges with getting the right services and supports in a language that's understandable. So sometimes healthcare services or disability services don't necessarily have the right interpreters to serve refugees who may not speak English or French. And so accessing those health services or disability services can be challenging. And sometimes there's a really big divide between settlement services that are designed to support newcomers and disability services that are designed primarily for Canadian citizens and people who have lived in Canada for a very long time. So it can be hard to find supports for kind of both areas as a refugee with a disability coming in Canada. I think the other thing the chapter talks about is how disability is understood differently in different cultures and communities, and a little bit across time too, since our understandings of disability have really changed. And like all the chapters in the book, there are a few kind of personal stories from refugees and discussions of how Indigenous knowledge kind of fits in with this topic. So it was really a priority for the editor of the book, Christina, but also all the collaborators to make sure that lived experience of refugees was reflected in the book, and also that Indigenous knowledge and experiences were reflected in the book. So part of that with the Indigenous experiences is to have specific chapters on things like colonization and forced migration, but it was also important to include Indigenous perspectives in all of the chapters. So that was interesting for me because it wasn't necessarily obvious at first how to do that. But what I ended up talking about a little bit in my chapter was about how Indigenous understandings of disability may be very different than Western understandings. So for example, there's one scholar that I cite and who talks about how in her community, there's not really a concept or a word for disability in, I think it's the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, but in her language and her culture, there's not really a concept or a word for disability. So it's not necessarily perceived as a negative thing like it is in Western contexts. And so there's an understanding that if a child is born with a disability, that every child is a gift to the community, and that every child may have something to teach the community. So a disability may be part of that, what the child has to bring or to teach the community, which is a very different understanding to kind of an understanding of disability as a problem or a defect or something like that. And so that's kind of how I tried to incorporate Indigenous perspectives in my chapter. In terms of lived experience, what a lot of the chapters do is include some stories or perspectives in the words and voices of refugees. So one of my little stories from refugees is about a play, actually, that was created by a refugee who came to Canada. And he made a short play about his experience. And in this play, he kind of leaves behind his old manual wheelchair, and he goes into his new motorized wheelchair. And it's kind of a symbol of his transition to Canada and how he was leaving his old life behind and being able to access those new technologies like the motorized wheelchair and new opportunities and kind of starting a new life in Canada. But at the same time, in the news story about this family, talks about some of the challenges and accessible housing and finding a housing that's accessible for wheelchair users can be really difficult for everyone in Canada, but especially for refugees who may be on a limited budget. And so the story talks about some of the challenges that they faced as well. So it's kind of a mixed story of the positives, seeing the positives about coming to Canada, but also really recognizing some of the challenges that continue to exist and the barriers that continue to be here in Canada. I've been working on issues related to refugee policy for quite a number of years, but primarily doing research about Canada's refugee sponsorship programs and refugee sponsorship in rural areas. And so venturing into the space of disability and refugees is a little bit new to me. But it turns out that there are very few scholars in Canada who are doing work on refugee issues and disability and kind of combining those two things together. And so I eventually agreed to write the chapter and use it as really an opportunity to summarize what is out there, but also some of the gaps of knowledge, gaps in research, and just to raise more awareness about some of these kinds of issues related to disability that really don't get mentioned or discussed much, either in academic circles or in policy circles. So I'm actually using some chapters from the book in the course that I'm teaching right now, and the students seem to appreciate it. We really tried with the book, and all the contributors tried to write the chapters in language that is more accessible than, say, in an academic article. So it's not written in overly technical language. There's a glossary, there's key takeaways. So we really tried to make it accessible to as broad of an audience as possible, which makes it a great resource for teaching courses, but also for kind of the more general public and for policymakers. So for students, I hope that they get a kind of general overview of some of the issues and experiences related to forced migration in Canada, including disability. And hopefully some of them will be inspired to pursue future research in this area and continue to work on issues related to disability and refugees. I know for me, really trying to remember and always be taking into account how Indigenous perspectives and lived experience of forced displaced people, how that comes into play in my own work will be something that I take away. So in terms of future research, I really do want to make sure that I'm incorporating Indigenous perspectives, that I'm incorporating the lived experiences of refugees and other people who have experienced displacement when I'm writing, when I'm teaching, when I'm doing work in this area. So I think there are lots of possibilities for change. Certainly Canada has a reputation of being this great welcoming haven for refugees, but the reality is much more mixed. There are certainly positive examples of where Canada has taken some great steps to welcome people who are fleeing conflict and persecution. But there are other examples where Canada has a lot more restrictive policies and where Canada has either intentionally or not, explicitly or not, pushed people out, kept people away, tried to prevent people from coming to Canada to claim asylum. So there's a lot more of a mixed picture when you really look into it. And so I think it's good to have a kind of balanced view of forced migration in Canada. Celebrate the positives, also acknowledge the negatives, and kind of together see that that Canada has a mixed record on forced migration. And so portraying that kind of accurate picture, which is not necessarily the narrative that's commonly out there in the news or in other places. The book was published by McGill-Queen's University Press this fall, and so it's available in a few different formats. So on the McGill-Queen's University Press website, you can order a physical copy if you prefer to read the physical book. There's also an ebook available through Amazon, so the Kindle edition, through Google Play, or through Kobo if you like to read ebooks. And there's also an open access edition. So if you're on the McGill-Queen's University Press website and you go to related links with the book, you will find a link to the open access edition, which is hosted by the Carleton University Repository. And so that's a way to get access to the book for people who might not otherwise be able to purchase the book or access it through a university library.